Hello, my dear students, and welcome once again to another video lecture for your class in Programming 2. In this video, I will introduce you to the concept of object-oriented programming. Object-oriented programming, or OOP, is a different approach to programming. It is very different to the programming approach that you have experienced so far. In the past, you have been doing what is known as procedural programming. OOP is so different from procedural programming. Some programmers are even very verbal about how they don't like OOP and how it is inherently bad. Me, however, I strongly believed in the potential and the robustness and all the positive implications of using object-oriented programming in real-life software development. I simply believe that while there are some situations that OOP might suck, there are a lot of other instances or situations where OOP can really help build the software for a majority of applications. Object-oriented programming is a programming paradigm that relies on the concept of classes and objects. It is used to structure a software program into simple, reusable pieces of code blueprints, usually called classes, which are used to create individual instances of objects. So in OOP, we write classes, which are blueprints. Then somewhere within the programs, you write instantiations, which will create an instance of the class. And this instance is called an object. And eventually, these objects are the ones that hold the data and the methods that perform executions using those data. So the basic structure of a class is that in OOP, a class defines an object. So the definition of the object is written in a class. By containing both the data, which are known as attributes, so the class contains attributes, which are the data, and actions or behaviors of an object, which is represented in the form of functions, which is known as methods. So the functions in OOP are called methods. And these methods are the things that describe the things that an object is supposed to do, or things that an object should do. As an analogy, take for example this object here. This is an object, right? And this object is a sword. And this sword has data about it. And there are plenty of data about this sword. But in the concept of object-oriented programming, we are going to take the data that are relevant based on our use. For example, this sword has length. We might need to use length for our program of the use of this sword. And this sword has width, as well as sharpness. So these are the data about the sword. And in OOP, these are stored in what is known as attributes. Now, aside from having data, an object also has some things that it can do, things that it can perform. For example, in the case of a sword, the sword can slice, the sword can stab, or the sword can block other strikes from other swords. And these are the things that this sword can do. In OOP, these are described in the form of methods. And again, methods are similar or just like the functions. But if a function belongs to a class, it is called a method. There are 4 pillars of the object-oriented programming. One is encapsulation, another is abstraction, another is inheritance, and finally, polymorphism. Encapsulation is when the data and the methods, the data which are the information, and the methods which are the actions of an object, are bundled into one entity. That is the concept of encapsulation. Abstraction simply means that we can describe entities without providing more details. For example, an animal can travel. An animal can travel. The travel, which is a verb, in this case, is abstract. Why? Because it's not detailed as to how an animal travels. As you can see, a horse is an animal, a bird, an eagle is an animal, and a whale is also an animal. These three are all animals. They all travel. But the word travel is abstract because there's no detail into how that animal can travel. So, when you go to a more specific form, like in the case of a whale, the whale swims. The bird, on the other hand, flies. And the horse runs on the ground. Okay? So, on the case of the entity animal, you have to abstract the traveling part. You just say that it will travel, but not specifically how it will travel, because on the application of the more specific forms, that is where they have different ways of traveling. So that is abstraction. Inheritance is a mechanism where you can define a class that is derived from another class, and then they share the same set of attributes and methods. Take, for example, a person can be derived from a mammal, or an employee can be derived from a person, because an employee is a person. A student can also be derived from a person because a student is a person. All the necessary details you need to describe a person has to be there in an employee or in a student, right? So in that manner, the class, if you had a class person, will become the parent class of another class, for example, a student or an employee. So the employee is derived from the person class, or the student is derived from the person class. This is possible in object-oriented programming. That way, you only have to describe a person, and then if you are going to make a more specific entity based on the person, then you'll just do inheritance. Finally, polymorphism. An object or reference basically can take multiple forms. So take the word poly means many, and morph means form. Thus the term polymorphism. It simply means that a reference to an object can take many forms. In analogy in the real life, we can, for example, we can give as an example yourself. You are a student, but besides being a student, in one way or another, you can also be transformed into another entity, such as, besides being a student, you are a friend. Besides being a student, you are a son or a daughter. I am a teacher, but I am also a father. This is the concept of polymorphism. And this can be implemented in an object-oriented programming. Don't worry if you are having some problems understanding these concepts. Anyway, this is just an introductory, and we will only do very basic object-oriented programming in our remainder of our course. But the more detailed concepts and more advanced concepts of OOP will be taken up in your ITE 203 course. At the moment, let's just take a look at how to write simple object-oriented programs. So here we are once again in our Visual Studio Code editor. And the first thing I'm going to do is to create a new file, and we'll call this person, right? This is person.java. We are going to describe a person. So first of all, we're going to say public class person. And then the first thing you need to do is to define the attributes. So here we put our attributes about the person. In this case, again, there are plenty of attributes that are available within a person, but you are going only to make use of the attributes or the information about a person that you need in this particular context of your program. So for example, if this is simply to be used by memberships or something like that, then you'll only be using those data or attributes that you need. For example, we'll have a string of the name of a person, and we'll have an address of a person, address actually, and maybe the phone number of a person, maybe just that. And perhaps let's add also an age, which is an int. So these are the attributes, and you define attributes outside of any block. Okay, so you should probably see that an attribute is a global variable within the class. So this is how you define attributes. Next is the methods. Now for the methods, these are again functions. So let's decide what this person can do in our program. Maybe we can make this person introduce himself. So you can say public void, because this particular thing that this person will do does not return any value. That is why it is void. Again, the rules of using functions apply here, because essentially a method is just a function. It's just that this function is defined in a class, and to give it more specific name, these are called methods. But essentially, methods and functions are theoretically the same. Okay? So public void, say introduce. And what this will do, it will simply display on the screen an introduction of this person. So it will say, it will probably say, hello, my name is, and then followed by the name. Okay, so basically this is how you write classes. Of course, you will, when you run this program, this will not do anything. This is not supposed to be executed. This is supposed to be referenced. A class is supposed to be instantiated, and so from the class you create an object, and from that object, that's where you are going to use the power of that object. Having this person object can have a name, an address, and a phone, and an age, and then it can introduce. Well, this is just a very silly program, but it demonstrates the use of object-oriented programming. Now, to make use of this person class, let's create another class which has a main method. So we'll just call this myapp.java. So again, public class myapp, and inside of here we're gonna create our main method, public static void main. And inside of the main, that is where we are going to make use of the person class. So here we're going to instantiate a person. And to instantiate a person, we say person, that's the class, and then we call the reference, we'll just call this P1, is equal to new. So the keyword here is new. The new keyword is the one that instantiates. So new person, and with a parenthesis. So now P1 is an object, and P1 being an object is an instance of the class person. So essentially P1 is a person object. Now, knowing that P1 is a person, P1 has 4 attributes and 1 method. Let's make use of this. So let's store data into P1. So P1 has an attribute of name. We can store into that the name of Joselito Sanchez. I don't know this guy, but it's just a coincidence that I thought of that name. Then P1 dot address is from Cantuslok. Another is the phone. The phone number of Joselito is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And the age of Joselito, remember that age is defined as an int, so you put there an int, say 23. Alright, so we have filled up the information or the data of P1, which is a person. So now, let's call or invoke an action that a person can do. You can say P1 dot introduce. Okay? So that's how you execute an object's method. Okay? So since this is a main method, this is an application class. Or this is an application, this is the one that is going to run. So let's try and run this program. Before we do that, let me first compile. Right there. Oops, we have an error. Yan naman nag-introduce mong koguan. It's nabutangan asa gani ha? Okay, again, we have one more error. P1.phone cannot find symbol. How is it? Phone number, manggod. So, say phone number. Okay. Alright, we have no more error. And so we can run my app. And it simply says, hello, my name is Joselito Sanchez. Of course, this is the one result of this call. But this is how we write simple object-oriented programs. In the next lessons, we are going to make use of more practical examples of object-oriented programming. Also, some more other concepts regarding object-oriented programming, such as access modifiers, accessors and mutators, things like that, that will be talked about in the next session. That will be all for this session. Thank you so much for watching, and see you again in the next one.